They had their work cut out for them because the first attempt at self-governance, the Articles of Confederation, had failed miserably. Under that system, the central government had been too weak to effectively govern the states. It lacked the power to tax or raise an army, and so the states were essentially running the country. Imagine trying to get 5 teenagers to clean the house and do their own laundry when they all have their own ideas about how things should be done. That's what it was like. Each state was sovereign, independent, and equal. There was no national court to settle disputes between them. The central government couldn't even make them comply. So there was no way it could enforce laws or collect taxes. The result was a country in chaos. But if the delegates couldn't fix this mess, then the country they'd fought so hard to win might fall apart before it even got started. But these men had experience with seemingly impossible challenges. They'd risked everything to sign the Declaration of Independence, endured Valley Forge, and won a war against the most powerful nation on earth. This story is how those 55 men created a government from scratch and solved problems that still resonate today. It was hot cockle summer in Philadelphia. George Washington was hoping for a cool breeze to temper the heat, but all he got was a thick fog rolling off the Delaware River. He stood with other delegates on the balcony of Independence Hall, watching the thick white cloud swallow up the buildings around them. As the heat rose, so did the stakes. If they failed, the new nation would descend into anarchy, and the world would likely just see the United States as a collection of unruly colonies instead of a unified country. On June, after weeks of debate, they adopted the Constitution of the United States, creating a federal republic with a powerful central government that would replace the weak central government under the Articles of Confederation. But how did they decide who should hold the power? James Madison wrote down his thoughts on how such a government should work in a 48-page document called the Virginia Plan. It proposed a new government with 3 branches: a legislative branch to make laws, an executive branch to enforce them, and a judicial branch to ensure they were constitutional. These branches would keep each other in check. In this way, no single branch would become too powerful. It was genius, but how could they possibly get 13 independent states to agree to it? Some delegates didn't want a strong central government at all. Small states feared that a strong central government would just become a tyrannical government that would take advantage of them. Large states knew that without a strong central government, they couldn't rule themselves. They needed to work together. The debate over representation quickly divided the convention into 2 groups. The larger states wanted representation based on population. Smaller states fiercely opposed this. How could they have an equal say in the new government if their populations were much smaller than some of the other states? Without representation, they would be at the mercy of the larger states. After all, wouldn't that just be like the British rule they'd just broken away from? But others argued that giving more voting power to the larger states would be like giving more power to more people. And how could they go back on the very ideals they'd affirmed in the Declaration of Independence? It was an argument that would shape America forever. Could the Union survive without representation? Could representation exist without taxation? Could taxation exist without violence? And how could they stop cycles of violence in the future? For 2 months, the Constitutional Convention went nowhere. Then something remarkable happened. On July, after being stuck for 2 months, a motion was made to end the stalemate. It was made by a delegate from Connecticut named Roger Sherman. Although small, Connecticut had a big idea. They proposed a compromise that gave each state to senators, guaranteeing smaller states equal representation. For representatives, the number would be based on population. This way, larger states would have more representatives, but smaller states would have the same amount of senators as larger states. This deadlock broke the stalemate and discussions began anew. The issue of representation also resolved the issue of taxation, since any representative would have to answer to his state and the people in it. Now they could start to hash out the specifics of how their new government would work. Another debate that had been holding them hostage was whether the president should be elected by the people or by the states. Some thought that having the states elect the president would protect against tyranny. Others thought that letting the states choose the president would just end up with presidents only being chosen from among the elite of the ruling class. But as the debates heated up, so did the weather. By mid-July, Philadelphia was sweltering. Evenings were filled with humidity and mosquitoes. Some historians speculate that the heat may have contributed to the tension. Just when it seemed like they might not be able to make any progress, George Washington stepped in. He asked the delegates to spend some time away from the hall, cooling off and getting their heads clear. They took his advice and spent a few days taking it easy. When they came back, they appointed a committee to draft a plan to resolve the issue. When James Madison got to work writing what would become the most famous 4 paragraphs in American history. The result was the Electoral College. Voters would elect electors. People pledged to vote for a particular candidate. These electors would meet in their state and vote for the president. But how many electors would each state get? How about 1 elector for every representative and senator? That way, large states would have more electors, but smaller states wouldn't be left out. The next issue was slavery. While the southern states depended on enslaved labor to run their economies, northern states were moving towards banning it. Southern states threatened to walk out of the Constitutional Convention if enslaved people were uncounted in the population numbers for determining representation. Otherwise, they said they'd lose political power. The delegates ultimately agreed to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. That way, southern states would keep their political influence, and the North wouldn't have to abolish slavery right away. But there was one more thing. How should disputes be settled in this new government? Some delegates favored a national court, but others worried that such a court would just become another tyrannical government. It was then that delegates turned to a man considered by many to be the father of the Constitution, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin. Having written Poor Richard's Almanac, which was read by everyone in the colonies, Franklin had an understanding of what average Americans wanted, and he'd also been a part of drafting the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. He talked about the need for a national court to settle disputes, saying that if the states were brothers, then the national court would be their impartial umpire. He believed the court would help prevent civil war. But Franklin understood that the delegates needed a way to resolve their differences during the Constitutional Convention itself. So he suggested a committee of 15 to draft a plan for settling disputes. Their plan would eventually become the foundation of the U.S. Supreme Court. Once the major issues were resolved, the delegates got to work formally writing the Constitution. But when it came to signing it, they were hesitant. Signing this document meant committing to a new form of government that had never been tried before. It meant giving up some of their individual power for the good of the whole, and it meant leaving behind the past and creating a new future for themselves and the country. After some persuading from a letter written by John Jay, the 55 men signed the Constitution of the United States on September 17, 1787. The process of creating the Constitution was slow and arduous, but the result was worth it. It established a stable government that balanced the will of the people with the need for law and order. It created a system that has lasted for centuries and inspired other nations to form their own governments. But it wasn't perfect. Many important issues, including the rights of women and minorities, were left out of the initial draft. However, it did include a process for amendment, meaning that its authors anticipated that the Constitution would grow and change over time to reflect the changing needs of the nation. Over the years, amendments have been added to address many of the issues that were ignored in the beginning. And that brings us to today. Today, we live in a world that can seem divisive and ununited, but we also live in a nation that was built by people who disagreed on almost everything except for their desire to create a better future. We can learn from their example and work together to solve our differences while honoring the past that brought us together. It's a tall order, but we're up for the task. After all, we're Americans.